So I have a really hard time expressing what I think about this topic of sustainability and resiliency and homesteading in general and community because fundamentally I do feel like it's all broken. It's been broken for a long time, and the nice fuzzy thought is to just want it to work, want it to be perfect, want to be able to depend on that community and that growing our own food is going to solve all the world's problems and everything's going to be great. But the reality of it is, without a great deal of effort and thought, dedication, and work, none of that is true. This morning we're having our cup of coffee, and as usual, it got us thinking. So today's video is going to be a bit of a thought-provoking, or hopefully thought-provoking video about the notions of resiliency and sustainability. Well, chickens are definitely a mainstay of almost any homestead, and there's a lot of good reasons for that. But I will say, not all chickens are created equal, and not all chickens work amazing in every situation, depending on your reasons for wanting to have them. And if you're already growing food, then you're already doing something amazing. And I don't want to downplay that at all. What I do think is there is levels to this. And I suppose the ideological part of my brain hopes that in the back of a lot of people's minds, eventually they would like to keep moving down that roadway, that pathway towards trying to be a little bit more sustainable and trying to be a little more resilient in their homesteading endeavors and feeding themselves. We're just going to call it feeding themselves because it's not just homesteading. There's a lot of other aspects to this. But I also realize up front, and I think this is actually a positive thought, it's not going to be the same path for everybody. It's not going to work the same way for everybody, and the variables are going to be different for everybody. And those are really important things to keep in mind as we go through this discussion. So if you're growing your own food and your main purpose really is to feed yourself, feed your family, have good food for your family, that's a pretty important value that you're trying to achieve. But if you're doing that with off-farm inputs, i.e. everything is coming from something that's been outsourced, whether it's feed, whether it's chicks, whether it's seeds, new plants, starts, etc. In a way, or one perspective on looking at this is you're gambling, because you're gambling on the fact year after year after year that that food is always going to be available for purchase from an entity that is not tied to your farm. So your main goal may be to feed yourself and your family healthily, but you're still essentially going to a casino every spring to get the tools that you need to keep going with it. So the term sustainable is a term that gets thrown around, in my opinion, far too often in modern times. It gets applied to everything as a justification that whatever it is better because it's sustainable. But I don't really feel that most of the time it's applied properly or anybody really understands what that means. So in the context of homesteading or growing your own food, what do I mean when I say sustainable? So I'm not going to go into like textbook definitions here because frankly anybody can look those up. But the base theory is you're able to do it basically forever, whatever it is. I think sustainability is a very difficult metric to meet, i.e. I don't think any of us will ever actually get there, because at the end of the day, the more you zoom out, the more you start to see the interconnected dependencies, the more complicated it gets, to the point at which you never really, in my opinion, can actually achieve true self-sufficiency, which I know is another topic often tied in with sustainability. So for me, I can't comprehend the notion that humans aren't part of the environment. That just it makes no sense when it takes animals and plants to feed us, and you can go down a huge rabbit hole there, but just keeping to that, when it takes other organisms to keep us alive, how is it that we can as a species sit there and say, well, we're above it, we're not part of it? And I think there's potentially problem number one when you're constructing a homestead is if you're looking at it as everything is just a replaceable piece of technology, which to some degree breeds and things are technology because we've changed them over time, plants and animals, to make them what we needed. But looking at them as disposable technology just because all the rest of our technology in life is disposable just doesn't really make a lot of sense to me. So recently we were watching a documentary on, of all things, commercial fisheries. But one thing that was really interesting as far as the description of how to summarize this, which it was applied to sustainability, but I think it also exemplifies from a personal level resiliency as well, was it looked at a commercial fishery in terms of, well, what is really sustainable or resilient? Well, think of the analogy of a bank account. If you have X amount of dollars in the bank, and that's your principal, right? Then that is making interest, for lack of a better way to put it. That interest, if you are only taking from the interest, then you're always maintaining the principal, which means technically, as long as this interest is always being created, you kind of can go forever. Obviously, that particular analogy has a lot of complexities to it, but if you take the same concept and you apply it to growing food, whether it's plants, animals, doesn't really matter. This is where we always talk about populations. You have to have a base population. As long as you have that base population and that base population reproduces, because everything we eat is basically coming from some form of reproduction, whether you're eating a plant like kale, you still have to have more kale plants produced to be able to eat the leaves, or you're eating beans, you still have to have more beans produced every year to keep eating beans. As long as you have that base population and you maintain that base population, then technically what you're growing is the interest. And by growing the interest, that allows you to basically consume the interest. And in this case, we actually eat it. And I think that's a fantastic analogy. So anybody who's followed along for a while knows that I love to use the example of chickens, more specifically meat birds or broilers. The reason why I use that is because it's so familiar to everybody. Broilers are composite breeds that are rather complicated to create. Those meat broilers or those meat birds are a fantastic way to meet a metric. And what I mean by metric is kind of a measure at which you think something is a good idea. That's what I'm going to use going forward in this discussion related to homesteading. So of course, the most appealing metric to meat birds is that they get big and they get big quickly. And if you look at those two metrics alone, you can't beat them. There really is no chicken that will beat those metrics. But I think a lot of people don't think about the other parts of the equation. When you purchase your birds, you bring them home, you're 13 or 14 or 15 or whatever weeks it is to grow them out. It's a short period of time in the grand scheme of the yearly cycle. You have a very little window that you have to look after those birds, and very little window that you have to feed them. But there's a whole backside to that that I think people don't like to think about. And it potentially is very similar to how a lot of people who aren't homesteading view the grocery store. I'm going to say it that way. They don't want to think about where the meat comes from. They don't want to think about how it was raised, etc. Well, to produce those broiler birds is not something you can do on a homestead scale. The vast majority of the people who are raising those are purchasing them from a commercial outlet. So on one side of the fence, if you're growing your own food to sort of know where your food came from and how it was raised, you've met those metrics too, because you know exactly how you raised them and you know exactly what you fed them. Those birds that you physically ate led a better life. But every year you're going back to that entity to buy more. There's a breeding flock somewhere. How were they raised? How were they looked after? And I don't think that's factoring into the equation in a lot of people's minds. When you're talking about the broiler example, you don't have a bank account. Somebody else has that bank account. And they're selling you the interest. So they're profiting off the interest, and you have no resiliency and you have no sustainability. So one way to look at it, you're feeding your family off of somebody else's interest. It starts to go down that line of, can you raise something else that would meet the same purpose? And I think that's where you start having to look at the metrics again, because if the only metric you care about is a big bird fast, you won't really find anything that does it better. It's no different than if you want to drive a really fast car the fastest car ever, you know where that's going to lead you on the technology spectrum. But are there things that you can either change in your behavior, which I think that's a big one, or change in what you're growing, and the two might be go hand in hand, that you could reduce your dependency. Homestead, no matter how big or how small it is, becomes part of your ecosystem. And the point is not to see how many pounds of production you can get out of your square footage of area that you're growing. That's important because that it directly equates to amount of food that you get to consume. But you're still building this system. If you're trying to build something resilient and go beyond just hand to mouth, I grew something, now I get to eat, and you're trying to build something that could continue on. So after kind of looking at that definition of sustainable or sustainability, I really do think when you're looking at some of those pathways, a better way to potentially look at it is resiliency. Now, resiliency is another tag word or another word that gets thrown around a lot. And again, I still feel it's not really well understood. It's not really very grounded when it comes to specific ideas or specific products, etc. But I'm going to try to summarize what I mean when I say resilience or resiliency in terms of homesteading and growing your own food. The big thing with resiliency for me is you're breaking some of those dependencies. So while you may never actually be able to achieve true sustainability or independence, if that's the metric you're going for, I think if you combine the two, you try to be more resilient and you look at where you can break some of those pathways. That is achievable for the vast majority of us. There are little things that you can do. They take time to build. They take time and effort to think about, but there's little things that you can do to inch ever closer to being less dependent. And I think that is the linchpin notion, less dependent on outside sources. And that's essentially why I use that broiler example as that starting point, because I think anybody who's like listened through this discussion can probably already in their mind think of things that may move them a little further towards that less dependent on the conventional system. Also, reducing your dependency on those outside feed sources, because one thing that I'm going to say from our history of raising livestock in a very general sense is there was a time earlier in our career as homesteaders where subsidies were far easier to tap into. And what I mean by that is subsidies in the form of feed. It was cheaper. And when feed was cheap, it was hard to, and we were even not maybe as dependent as some, but it was hard to rationalize. Why would I go to the extra effort when I can buy cheap food? But really, that's the crux on the doomy side of things that's kind of got us in the situation recently where we're questioning it again. Because going back several decades, there was always that promise of everything will be taken care of for you, which is why a lot of people stopped farming and raising their food and having gardens in the first place, because it's work. Well, I'm standing in front of our ram lambs, or soon to be rams, that we're going to use for our breeding season in 2023 for 2024 lambs. And I think this is a good example of building some resiliency, because Icelandic sheep, they're not rare, but they're not super common. But we make a conscious decision to keep multiple males so that we don't always have to go and get new ones. Although, at the same time, we have actually, and he's not going to put on a good show for us, we have actually added a new ram to the roster this year to mix things up. So that's kind of that, I guess, relying on community, because they are registered, so we can always tap into that to help you meet your goals. Actually, we technically traded for him to change up some things with our flock. So that is an excellent example of how you can build resiliency in a community. I think humans have this tendency to look at a discussion that's presented to them on an idea that they haven't thought about themselves as if it's prescriptive, like it's negative that somebody with knowledge or background or what have you is presenting it to them, and I don't want this to be that. Just because I've been doing it for 15 years doesn't mean I'm right on everything. But at the same time, there has been a lot of thought put into everything that we do. And while on one side of the fence, we can kind of make the joke and be like, yeah, we've tried everything, etc., etc. And a lot of it's failed. A lot of it's failed. We've learned a lot from that. And I still think there's value there, because if everybody goes by trial and error, i.e., we started at a time before there was a lot of people doing it, for lack of a better way to put it. If everybody goes by trial and error, nobody's really going to get anywhere. Cats. Oh, somebody's.
They're definitely needed in the quest for resiliency. Someone really wants some attention there.
So this is where I think another real common tag word or concept comes up about being self-sufficient. I actually don't believe that any human can truly be self-sufficient, because you're always going to be, if nothing else, you're always going to be affected by what goes on around you. If we kind of go back to sustainable resiliency and self-sufficiency, technically self-sufficiency means you have that principle and you're completely insulated around whatever goes on around you. But the reality of it is, this is, I think, where there is a positive to community, because if everybody in the community has a principle, and the principle could be goods and or services or skills, it can be all of those things, but if the community has to be built off of people that have that. If everybody has that principle, then they've always got some interest, and it's the interest that they can share with each other. And in a way, I think that's where the internet, and in particular YouTube and the homesteading community, is really interesting, because you have a whole lot of people that have principle in the form of skills. You also have a lot of people sometimes that are pretending they have those skills, trying to sort of prove to you that if you follow what they say, you will be successful. But you really want to be following the people that have this solid principle of skills. They're sharing information with you in the form of that excess or that interest that you can then, and this kind of goes back to what I said about, if everybody tries to reinvent the wheel, nobody really gets anywhere, because you're never really building this, because you're building it in isolation of everybody else. But if you have a community, online or physical, or both, potentially even better, that is full of people that have this principle, then that actually is the step forward to having an actually sustainable community. So that's kind of today's video. We haven't done one of these sort of deep dives into the theory or thoughts. Recently, I know we've gained a lot of subscribers who maybe haven't been exposed to one of these videos. So hopefully you found it interesting, and hopefully it did make you think or get your wheels thinking, because the last point I'm going to make on this video is, if you are trying to live a homesteading lifestyle, and I think this goes back all the way through history, if you're trying to be resilient, trying to be sustainable, or just trying to survive, the reality of it is, it's a modern convenience to be able to shut off and just not think about things. If you're homesteading and growing your own food, you're going to be constantly thinking, and hopefully this maybe gives a little bit of a push to get those cogs going a bit, because we are horrible for it. We never stop thinking, to the point at which maybe it's a negative. But if we all did that, and we all kept thinking and pushing ourselves a little bit further, just think of where we would actually be in terms of that community that everybody talks about.